The laughter came from the back of the room, and nobody tried to stop it. It wasn't loud. That was the thing about it. It wasn't the kind of laughter that fills a gymnasium or bounces off warehouse walls. It was controlled, the way men control things when they want you to hear it, but still want to call it something else if you object. A few sounds quickly covered. A shoulder nudge. Eyes that slid sideways and then away. Staff Sergeant Nora Laine stood at the door of the briefing room at Fort Cavett and did not look at the men who were laughing. She was 31 years old. She had been in the United States Army for 9 years. She held the door handle for exactly 2 seconds longer than necessary, and then she let it go and walked to the last open chair at the far end of the table. She sat down. She put her notebook on the table. She uncapped her pen. Nobody spoke to her. That was also a thing they did. Not hostility, exactly, nothing you could report. Just the particular silence that forms around a person when a room has decided without discussion that the person is not part of the room. Colonel Harwick stood at the front, pointing at a topographic map pinned to the board. He was talking about elevation and wind patterns and a ridge line 11 kilometers northeast of the training complex. And Laine listened and wrote down everything that mattered and some things that didn't, because she had learned early that you never know which detail becomes the one that saves you. "We've had problems," Harwick said. 3 weeks of problems. I want them resolved before the joint evaluation. What he meant, what everyone in the room understood he meant, was this. The brigade's long-range qualification scores had come back low. Not slightly low, embarrassingly low, for a unit that was supposed to be sending 2 teams to an inter-service assessment in 6 weeks. The kind of low that generated phone calls from people whose rank insignia had stars on it. What no one said out loud was the specific number, 14 attempts. 14 attempts at the 300-meter qualification target, run across 3 separate sessions over 12 days, 0 confirmed impacts. Laine had not been in any of those sessions. She had been assigned to logistics coordination for the past 4 months, a posting that made sense on paper and made no sense if you had ever watched her shoot. She had requested a transfer back to range work twice. Both requests had been processed and filed, and, as far as she could tell, had gone nowhere, the way requests go nowhere, when the person receiving them doesn't want to be bothered with the answer. She wrote down the wind data from the map. She wrote down the ridgeline coordinates. She did not volunteer anything. After the briefing, in the hallway outside, a man named Sergeant Dubeck fell into step beside her. Dubeck was one of the few people in the unit who talked to her the way people talk to other people, which is to say directly and without performing. "You heard the scores," he said. "I heard. You have something to say about it?" "No." Dubeck looked at her. "You have something to say about it?" "I have nothing to say about it." He let it go. He knew when she meant it and when she didn't. This was one of the times she did. The range at Fort Cavett sat at the bottom of a long slope of scrubgrass and loose shale, and the wind off the valley to the west came in unpredictable, shifting gusts that could change direction 3 times in 40 seconds. The 3,200-meter target was not visible to the naked eye from the firing position. That was the point. You worked from data and calculation and the small, specific knowledge that accumulated in a person who had spent enough time behind a scope to begin to understand what the air was doing before it did it. Laine had grown up in a flat part of eastern Colorado where the wind came without apology and the distances were long. Her grandfather had been a patient man with no formal education who nonetheless understood the way some people understand things. The relationship between stillness and precision. He had taught her to shoot when she was 11, not to compete. Not for sport, exactly. He had taught her the way you teach someone to read a map or bake bread, as a thing worth knowing, a skill that would be there when you needed it. By the time she was 16, she was grouping shots at 800 meters that her grandfather would study for a long time before saying anything. By the time she enlisted, she had stopped keeping track of her distances because the numbers had stopped surprising her. The Army had noted her qualification scores. They had noted them the way you note something that doesn't fit the existing framework, carefully, skeptically, and then filed in a place where it wouldn't cause problems. She understood this. She had understood it for a long time. Understanding it did not mean she accepted it. It meant she had learned to work around it the way water works around stone, not by confronting it, but by being consistently, persistently present until the stone eventually had to account for her. The call came at 0600 on a Tuesday. She was in the motor pool reviewing fuel logs when Dubeck found her. He had a look on his face she hadn't seen before, Something between urgency and reluctance, like a man delivering news he's not sure how the recipient is going to receive. Harwick wants you at the range, he said. Why? General Aldiss is here. She set down the fuel log. Here is in on post, here is in at the range. With his aide and 2 colonels I don't recognize, and whatever the thing is called when a general decides to observe a qualification exercise in person. She thought about this for a moment. What happened? Sutherland blew out his shoulder in PT yesterday. He was the last of the qualified long-range shooters they were going to put in front of Aldiss today. Dubek paused. There's nobody else, Laine. She picked the fuel log back up. She made a small notation on it. Then she put it down again and looked at him. What does Harwick know about my range record, she said. He's had access to your file for 4 months. She nodded slowly. Okay, that's it? Okay? That's it. She went to get her gear. The range was a different place when a general was present. The air changed. People stood differently. Even the men who had spent years around senior officers had a quality of controlled alertness that wasn't there on ordinary days. Backs not quite at attention, voices a register, lower, movements deliberate and small. General Marcus Aldiss was 62 years old and had the particular economy of motion that some men develop over long military careers, where nothing is wasted and everything is measured. He stood at the observation platform with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the valley without appearing to watch anything specific. Harwick was beside him. When Laine arrived, Harwick turned and looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Sergeant Laine, he said. Sir, you're aware of the situation. Sergeant Dubek briefed me. Harwick nodded. He looked like a man who had made a decision he wasn't entirely certain about and had decided to commit to it anyway. You've done long-range work. Yes, sir. At what distances? She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the qualification target today is at 3,200 meters. I know, sir. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, General Aldiss, this is Staff Sergeant Laine. She'll be representing the unit in today's demonstration. Aldiss turned. He looked at her with the same unhurried attention he had been giving to the valley. He did not say anything for a moment. Sergeant, he said. General, how long have you been at Cabot? 4 months, sir. Previously 18 months at Wentworth. What was your primary role at Wentworth? Range instruction and long-range qualification training, sir. Something shifted in Aldiss's expression. It was small, a very slight adjustment around the eyes, the kind that happens when information lands differently than expected. He looked at Harwick. Harwick did not look back. All right, Aldiss said. Let's see what we've got. She had learned, over years of shooting in front of people who had opinions about whether she should be there, to make herself very small inside her own head in the minutes before. Not to think about the audience, not to think about what a miss would mean or what a hit would mean or what any of it would mean for her career or her standing or any of the things that people think about when they are trying not to think about things. She thought about the wind. The wind at Fort Cabot this morning was coming from the southwest at approximately 11 miles per hour with intermittent gusts that she had been tracking for the past 6 minutes. The gusts came roughly every 40 to 60 seconds and lasted between 4 and 8 seconds. There was a secondary crosswind at the lower elevation near the target zone that she had calculated from the flag position she could see through the scope. Flags placed at intervals down the range specifically for this kind of reading. She thought about the elevation. The target platform was lower than the firing position by approximately 40 meters over the course of the 3,200-meter distance. She had already adjusted. She thought about the ammunition. She had checked the load herself. She had her own data book, carried everywhere, filled with notes in her own precise shorthand. Temperatures, humidity readings, barrel temperatures, the small accumulation of knowledge that serious shooters keep the way scientists keep lab notebooks. She did not think about the men standing behind her. She did not think about the fact that 14 attempts had preceded her, and none of them had connected. She thought about the wind. The scope settled, her breathing slowed. She had a particular thing she did before a shot. Not a ritual exactly, more a habit of attention. A way of checking in with herself that had nothing to do with psychology and everything to do with the simple question. Are you here? Are you present? Is everything else gone? It was gone. The wind dropped. In the brief pocket of stillness that followed, she pressed the trigger. The sound of a long-range shot is different from what people imagine. At the firing position, it is enormous, a concussive crack that pushes against the chest. But then there is the period of waiting, the seconds in which the bullet is traveling a distance that the mind struggles to hold, and during those seconds the range is completely silent. Nobody speaks. It is a particular kind of silence, taut and specific, unlike any other. Then the target fell. She heard it before she saw it confirmed. The distant mechanical snap of the impact plate, registering a hit, transmitted back through the spotting equipment. She heard it and she kept her cheek against the stock and her eye against the scope for another 3 seconds, because that was what she always did, and then she straightened up. Behind her, nobody said anything for a moment. Then Colonel Harwick said, very quietly, "Confirmed impact." Aldiss was looking at the spotting scope. He stayed there for several seconds. When he straightened up, his expression was the expression of a man who had been shown something that required him to update something he had previously believed. "How long have you been making shots at that distance?" he said. 7 years, sir. And you've been in logistics coordination for 4 months. It wasn't a question. He said it the way you say something when you are working out the implications of a fact. "Yes, sir." He looked at her. Then he looked at Harwick. Then he looked back at the range. "Get me her full file," he said to his aide. Today, the debrief happened in a room too small for the number of people in it, which was 10, not counting Laine. She sat in the corner with her data book on her knee and listened to the conversation that was happening around her and occasionally about her as though she were not there. She had been in rooms like this before. She had learned not to find it strange, the way people can talk about a person in the third person while that person is present. Not out of malice, usually, but out of a habit of thinking that was older and more ingrained than any individual in the room. You referred to the person as a file, as a record, as a set of numbers, because that was the framework the room was built on. What was different this time was Aldiss. He had a way of asking questions that made it difficult to answer without precision. Not aggressive, nothing like that. Just very, very specific. He asked Harwick how many range-certified personnel the unit currently had available. He asked what the qualification standards were for long range. He asked very quietly how it had come to pass that a soldier with Laine's documented record had been in logistics coordination for 4 months without a return to range work. Harwick's answer was detailed and plausible and did not fully answer the question. Aldiss waited until the answer was finished. Then he said, "I'm going to need better than that." The room got quiet in a different way. Laine kept her eyes on her data book. She made a small notation she didn't need to make. She had learned to give herself something to do with her hands when rooms got quiet like that, because the alternative was to look up. And looking up in those moments had never done her any good. After the debrief in the hallway, Dubeck found her again. "Well," he said. "Well," she said, "you know what's going to happen. Some things will change. Some things won't." "That's a generous read." She looked at him. "I've been doing this for 9 years, Dubeck. I know what one good day changes and what it doesn't." She paused. "But some things, that's real." He was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth," she said. "I'm not saying it isn't." She meant it. She had learned to mean it, to take what was real and let it be real, without asking it to be more than it was. What happened in the weeks that followed was not a transformation. It was not a movie ending. Nobody apologized, exactly. Nobody gathered in a room and acknowledged, out loud, the specific nature of what had been allowed to happen. That is not how institutions work, and Laine had never expected it to be. What happened was smaller and more durable. General Aldiss's aide pulled her file within 48 hours. 2 weeks later, she received orders reassigning her to the Advanced Long-Range Instruction Program at Fort Blaine. The program that trained the trainers. The assignment that went to the people whose range records were the kind you didn't argue with. The assignment she had been qualified for, on paper, for the better part of 3 years. Harwick, at their final meeting before she transferred out, said that he thought she had represented the unit well. She thanked him. She did not say anything else, because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said. Dubeck drove her to the transport in the pre-dawn dark, and they talked about nothing in particular. The weather, a piece of equipment he was having repaired, a movie he had seen and thought was unremarkable. At the gate, he stopped the vehicle and she got out and got her bag, and he sat with the window down. "You going to be okay up there?" he said. "I'm always okay." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I'm going to be okay up there." He nodded. He put the vehicle in gear. She watched him drive away, and then she turned and walked through the gate with her bag over one shoulder and her data book in her front pocket, the same data book she'd been keeping since Wentworth, pages dense, with wind readings and elevation notes, and the accumulated record of every shot that had taught her something. She had never needed anyone's permission to know what she was. That was the thing about the last 9 years. They had not built that knowledge. They had tested it, repeatedly, systematically, in ways both large and small, and it had held. The wind off the airfield came from the northwest at about 9 miles per hour, steady, without the gusts that had complicated the shot at Cavett. She noted it automatically, the way she noted everything, filed it away with the rest of the data she would never stop collecting. Then she went to find her flight.